The cabin in the woods. Horror story. My childhood basically boils down to, if we wanted to eat something other than corn, then we would have to hunt it. I've never hunted for fun, but sometimes, when it's hard to make ends meet, then I'll take a walk in the woods. That day, I went hunting in the woods on a cloudy afternoon. I love the feeling of being in nature, surrounded by trees and animals. My grandfather had made me a very good hunter, so when it came to tracking or orienteering, I was an expert. I walked into the forest with my rifle in hand and my pack on my back. I don't remember exactly how long I walked for. I just know that I walked for hours, following my hunting instinct. Sometimes I stopped to admire the landscape, the beauty of nature in its purest state. But when I wanted to go back, I realized that I was completely lost. I tried to find my way back. At first, I was not really worried, because although it was the first time I visited that part of the forest, I felt confident of my sense of direction. However, every step I took seemed to take me further away from my starting point. Night was beginning to fall, and the cold was becoming more intense. I began to feel a shiver run through my body. Darkness surrounded me, and the fog made my vision difficult. It was then that I saw a light in the distance, a small, lonely cabin. Far from what anyone would think, that was not so strange. After all, I had grown up in a similar place, so if the inhabitants of that cabin looked a little like my grandfather, then I was saved. I approached it and noticed that it was in pretty bad shape. The wood was rotten and the door was wobbling in the wind. I noticed that what I had thought was light was nothing more than the reflection of the moon through one of the windows. There was no doubt that this was not the best place to spend the night, but I had no choice. If my grandfather had taught me anything, it was to respect the forest at night. Besides, I was sure that with the help of daylight, I could regain my sense of direction, so I went inside. The inside of the cabin was even worse. There were cobwebs everywhere, and the musty smell was unbearable. I realized that no one had lived there for a long time, but at least I would have a roof over my head and could get some rest. I had to clean up a bit so I could light a small fire without fear of the cabin catching fire while I slept. I cooked the squirrels I had hunted and curled up next to that fire, which emitted a comforting warmth, trying to keep warm. But I couldn't help feeling uneasy, as if there was something else in the cabin with me. I lay down on the floor, trying to sleep, but it was impossible. I was about to fall asleep when suddenly I started to hear strange noises inside the cabin. It sounded as if something or someone was moving around me. It was almost as if they were running, so I thought it was some kind of animal. I got up quickly and looked around, but I didn't see anything. I thought maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, louder this time. That's when I saw them. A group of scary-looking women with disheveled hair and wrinkled skin burst into the cabin. They were witches, there was no doubt about it. I immediately got up to flee, but was quickly overpowered. The witches pinned me down and began to chant a strange ritual. They seemed to be chanting satanic chants in Latin or some ancient language, which, even though I didn't understand a word they were saying, I knew couldn't be good. It wasn't long before I realized I was being part of some sort of ritual, and fear gripped me. The witches took me to the center of the hut, where there was a strange altar that I was sure wasn't there when I entered the hut. There, they tied me up with ropes, and again began to chant in a language I did not understand. They whirled me around moving around me as I struggled to free myself. Suddenly, I felt one of them approach me and pull out a dagger. It made a long, deep cut all the way down my forearm. The pain was unbearable, but luckily I managed to free myself because one of my arms was a little loose. So, taking advantage of their carelessness, I broke free from the ropes and ran out of the hut. I ran as fast as my legs would let me. However, I could hear how those horrible witches began to chase me, screaming and cursing me in a strange language. I ran without looking back, trying to find my way out of the forest. But no matter how hard I ran, the witches gave me no respite. They kept chasing me closer and closer. Desperate to escape the witches chasing me, I ran relentlessly through the dense forest. The night was dark, and the undergrowth hindered my progress, but adrenaline and fear drove me on. With every step, I could hear the terrifying screams of the witches echoing behind me, which made me redouble my efforts. My lungs burned and my legs felt weak, but I knew I couldn't give up. I moved deeper into the undergrowth, trying to lose myself in the trees and bushes to throw my pursuers off my trail. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the only hope I had was to find a safe hiding place where I could spend the night. Finally, I found a thick thicket that seemed to offer sufficient cover. I crouched down and crawled through the undergrowth, trying hard not to make any noise that might give me away. I stood still, not daring to move, as the witches rushed past me at full speed. The sound of their footsteps gradually faded away, until finally only silence remained. I remained hidden in the undergrowth, aware that I could not come out of my hiding place until daybreak. The cold of the night clung to my body, but I dared not move or light a fire so as not to reveal my position. Time seemed to pass slowly as I waited in the darkness. Every little noise made me shudder, fearing that the witches had found me again. But as the hours passed, the forest became calm and the light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Finally, as the first rays of sunlight appeared on the horizon, I decided it was safe to come out of hiding. Cautiously, I got up and started walking, looking for my way back home. Although I was exhausted and injured, the determination to return to the safety of my home drove me onward. Step by step, I traced the terrain, using the knowledge my grandfather had passed down to me. Finally, after an arduous effort, I managed to find the right path and set out for home. Relief came over me as I saw the familiar scenery and felt the familiarity of the place. As I moved away from the forest and approached my village, I felt a deep sense of gratitude that I had managed to escape the clutches of the witches. When I got there, I was exhausted and trembling with fear. I met the villagers and told them what had happened to me in the forest. They looked at me with amazement and fear and told me that the legend of the witches of the forest was well known in the region. They told me that many years ago, when settlers first came to the area, it was rumored that witches inhabited the forest. Legend has it that the witches performed dark rituals and human sacrifices to gain power and wealth. People were afraid to go into the forest, and many disappeared without a trace. Since then, it is said that the witches still inhabit the forest and are always looking for new victims for their dark rituals. I was told that I was lucky to have escaped alive, as most people who enter the forest are never seen again. The Cabin of the Forest. Horror story. That night, I stayed in the village, but I could not sleep. Images of the witches and their dark ritual haunted me. I knew I could never forget what I'd experienced in the forest. From then on, I never hunted there again and warned everyone I knew to stay away from the forest and the abandoned cabin. After my chilling encounter with the witches in the woods, my life changed completely. I became cautious and suspicious, always on the lookout for any sign of danger. Nightmares about that night haunted me constantly, reminding me how close I came to losing my life. After a long period of time, I began to believe that the witches and their dark ritual were just part of a nightmare that was behind me. I was determined to leave all that in the past and resume my normal life. However, fate had other plans for me. It was on a cold and rainy night that I again had a disturbing encounter with witches. I was walking through the lonely streets of the town, trying to clear my mind and forget the disturbing memories. Suddenly, I felt a piercing gaze that seemed to burn my back. I turned quickly and came face to face with a dark and sinister figure. It was a witch, with her disheveled hair and menacing gaze. I froze for a moment, not knowing how to react. The witch smiled maliciously at me and, before I could say a word, disappeared into the darkness of the night. From that moment on, the witch's apparitions became more and more frequent in my life. No matter where I was, I always felt their presence haunting me. Even in broad daylight, I could see shadows moving inexplicably and hear ominous whispers all around me. One night, while trying to convince myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination, I woke up startled to hear disturbing murmurs all around me. I opened my eyes slowly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. To my horror, I found myself surrounded by the witches once again. The witches were there, their pale faces and piercing eyes locked on me. Their sinister laughter echoed in the air, filling me with a deep fear. I felt as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which I could not escape. I tried to back away, to look for a way out, but the witches were getting closer and closer, closing the circle around me. Malicious whispers filled my ears, their voices intertwined in a cacophony of evil. I felt my heart beating wildly as despair took hold of me. I woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat and my heart pounding uncontrollably. I tried to reassure myself that it had all been just a dream, a vivid nightmare that had brought me to the brink of panic. However, an intense burning in my back reminded me that something else was going on. I quickly got up and ran to the bathroom to inspect my back in the mirror. There, to my horror, I saw how a series of crudely traced cuts formed an inverted pentagram on my skin. The pentagram was surrounded by red inflammation and seemed to burn with an invisible fire. My mind was filled with confusion and fear. How had this happened? I didn't remember getting those cuts, let alone tracing a pentagram on my own back. Had it been the witches' work? Had they left a mark on me to remind me of their constant presence? From that day on, my health began to deteriorate rapidly. I developed high fevers, intense body aches, and constant weakness. No doctor could find an explanation for my condition, and medical tests revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The disease seemed to feed on my energy and vitality, leaving me increasingly weakened. I spiraled into despair as I struggled to find a cure or a way to reverse the effects of that cursed pentagram. I searched tirelessly through old books, consulted experts in the occult, and tried various purification rituals, but nothing seemed to work. The pentagram was still marked on my back, preventing me from regaining my health and my normal life. As time passed, I realized that the solution would not come from conventional sources. I delved into the darkest of magic, searching for answers in dangerous and forbidden places. I faced supernatural creatures, crossed boundaries I never imagined crossing, and risked my own sanity. My body and mind became a battleground between illness and my will to live. Every day was a constant struggle, as the pentagram on my back became more prominent and the discomfort intensified. With each passing day, my health weakened even more. I felt my vital energy slowly draining away, leaving me exhausted and on the verge of collapse. The pentagram on my back was becoming more and more prominent, as if it was growing and spreading across my skin. One day, as I was passing in front of an old church, a priest caught up with me and stopped me. His eyes reflected compassion and concern as he observed my sickly state. Without a word, he invited me into the church, saying he could help me. Intrigued and desperate to find some form of relief, I accepted his offer and followed him inside the church. Once inside, the priest began to pray fervently, invoking divine protection over me. As his words echoed through the air, a strange feeling came over my skin. I began to feel an intense itching, as if millions of tiny insects were walking under my epidermis. The discomfort was becoming unbearable, but the priest did not stop praying, focusing on his task with determination. My body began to writhe involuntarily, unable to bear the sensation that invaded me. And then, without warning, I vomited a black, viscous substance. It came out of my mouth in large quantities, leaving a disgusting trail on the floor of the church. The priest showed no fear or disgust, but continued to pray with even more fervor, as if he were fighting a spiritual battle. The black substance seemed to have no end, coming out of me in a grotesque dance of revulsion. I felt how something evil was leaving my body, how the curse that afflicted me was being expelled little by little. Each time I vomited, my discomfort diminished, and with it, a small part of the darkness that consumed me faded away. Finally, when there was nothing left to expel, I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and relieved. The priest approached me with a relieved expression on his face and offered me his hand to help me up. Grateful, I accepted his help and stood up, feeling lighter and free of the burden that had afflicted me for so long. Although the priest had freed me from the oppressive presence of the witches, the nightmares persisted in my mind. Night after night, I found myself immersed in a dark world of tormenting dreams. In those nightmares, the witches came back to haunt me with their malevolent laughter and hate-filled eyes. I would see them lurking in the shadows, watching me with an unquenchable thirst for revenge. Their distorted and grotesque image was engraved in my mind, and I could feel the terror and helplessness seizing me. They chased me through the dark woods, casting curses and spells that sought to trap me in their sinister domain. As the days passed, however, I noticed that the nightmares slowly began to fade. They were becoming less frequent and less intense. It seemed that the darkness that had taken root within me was dissipating, as was the pentagram on my back. Over time, the pentagram, which had once been an open wound, began to heal. The skin around the cuts was regenerating, and little by little the marks were disappearing. It was as if the symbol of my torment faded away along with the nightmares, leaving room for healing and renewal. As the pentagram faded, so did the nightmares. The darkness that had been plaguing my mind began to give way to the light of hope and strength. While I could still remember the horrors I had experienced, and feel a certain restlessness in my heart. I knew I was on the road to recovery. With the support of the priest and my own determination, I was able to overcome the nightmares that had tormented me for so long. I learned to face my fears and resist the destructive power of the witches. While the battle was not easy, I realized that I was stronger than I thought I was. Today, the nightmares are only a vague memory. Although the witches may cross my mind in moments of vulnerability, I do not allow their presence to control me. I have found peace within myself and am committed to living my life without being a slave to fear. Thank you for joining us for this spine-tingling story. We hope you found it both thrilling and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this video, please consider participating in our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing it with your friends. Your support goes a long way in helping us create more engaging content for you. Goodbye, and may you always tread carefully in the world of the unknown.